She wanted her name on the deed to my house. I did not raise my voice. I did not pound the table. I simply looked at my son across that white linen table, surrounded by 40 of our closest friends and family, and I said no. What happened in the next 60 seconds changed everything. Let me back up. My name is not important. What I am is a 64-year-old man who spent 37 years building a civil engineering firm from a one-room office with second-hand furniture and a telephone that cut out every time it rained. I started that company when my son Marcus was 2 years old, when my wife Carol was working double shifts at the hospital to keep the lights on while I chased contracts nobody else wanted. We were a team. We were a unit. Everything I ever built, I built with her standing next to me. Even when standing next to me meant barely sleeping, barely eating, clipping grocery coupons, and believing in a future that wasn't visible yet. Carol passed 4 years ago, ovarian cancer. It took her 11 months, and when it was over, I was left with a house full of her things, a business I didn't know how to run without her confidence behind me, and a son who had her eyes and none of her character. That last part took me longer to accept than I care to admit. Marcus is 36. He works for my company, or he did as Director of Business Development, a title I created for him because he had a business degree and I wanted him close. He is handsome, well-dressed, charming at a dinner table, and utterly incapable of understanding that money does not fall from the sky. He has never gone without. That is my failure, and I own it. When Carol was alive, she was the one who made him wash his own car, cook his own meals, understand what $1 actually cost. After she was gone, I compensated with generosity, because grief does strange things to judgment. And I missed her so much I poured that love into my son, like I was filling a hole that could never be filled. Vanessa came into the picture 3 years ago. She is 32, the daughter of a dentist in Scottsdale, educated, attractive, and possessed of an entitlement so deeply embedded that I do not think she even recognizes it as a flaw. She sees it as a personality. When she and Marcus got engaged, I welcomed her. I threw them an engagement party at my home. I paid for it. When they needed a down payment for their condo in downtown Phoenix, I wrote a check $40,000 without being asked twice. When Vanessa decided she wanted to leave her marketing job and launch a home decor business, I funded the startup costs, $12,000, which I gave as a gift, not a loan, because Marcus told me she was embarrassed about the optics of a loan. I want to be clear about all of this, not to be praised for it, but because what came later requires you to understand the foundation that was already in place. My 64th birthday was in October. Marcus and Vanessa offered to host a dinner in my honor at Carmine's, which is a steak restaurant in Scottsdale that I have always been partial to. Private dining room in the back. White tablecloths. The kind of place where the bread arrives warm and nobody rushes you. They said they wanted to do something special, that it would be 40 guests, a real celebration. I was genuinely touched. I told my assistant, Tom, to take the night off. I told my accountant, Gerald, that I would see him the following week. I wore the charcoal blazer Carol had bought me for our anniversary 2 years before she got sick, because I still wear it on occasions that matter. I arrived early. The room was already half full with people I loved, colleagues, old friends, Carol's sister Patricia and her husband, my neighbor Frank, who has known me for 22 years. Marcus was at the bar looking sharp in a blue suit. Vanessa was in red, her hair done, smiling the way she smiles when she wants something and has decided tonight is the night to ask for it. I noticed the smile. I filed it away. The evening was warm at first. Good wine, good food, people standing to say kind things about me and about Carol, which always breaks me open a little, but in the way that feels like gratitude rather than grief. Patricia told a story about the first time she met me when I showed up to Carol's parents' house with a cracked windshield and a box of donuts as a gift. And everyone laughed, and I laughed too, and for a while the room felt full in the way it used to feel when Carol was still in it. Then the entrees were cleared. The dessert hadn't arrived yet, and Marcus stood up, not to make a toast, but in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed something and is choosing his moment. He tapped his glass. The room quieted. He talked for a few minutes about gratitude, about what I had sacrificed to build the business, about the legacy I had created. It was well written, probably by Vanessa, and he delivered it sincerely enough that I felt a flush of pride. And then he said he and Vanessa had a question for me, that they had been doing some planning, thinking about the future, and they thought tonight, surrounded by the people who love me, was the right time to discuss it. He sat down. Vanessa opened her clutch and placed a manila folder on the table. I looked at the folder. I looked at my son. I understood immediately what this was. The house, my house. The one Carol and I bought in Paradise Valley in 2003. The one we renovated together. The one where I still sleep in the same bedroom we shared for 21 years, has been appraised at just over $2 million. Marcus had been circling it for about a year. Small comments. Questions about whether I really needed 4 bedrooms. Whether the maintenance was too much for one person. Whether it made more financial sense to downsize into something newer, easier, closer to him and Vanessa. I had answered each of these comments with patience and a closed door. The folder contained a transfer of title document, pre-filled, my name, their names, a notary seal already at the bottom waiting for a signature. Vanessa slid it toward me across the table. She said, in a voice calibrated to sound reasonable, that they had spoken to a real estate attorney and that this structure made the most sense for estate planning, that keeping the house in my name alone created complications, that they were trying to protect me. She said the word protect with her head tilted slightly. The way you talk to someone you have already decided is past the age of making decisions for himself. I looked at the document. I looked at the folder. I looked at the 40 people in that room who had gone very quiet. I said no. Vanessa's expression didn't change right away. It held for a moment, perfectly composed, the way a face holds just before it decides it doesn't need to be composed anymore. Then she said, still quietly, that she didn't think I understood the tax implications of leaving a property like that in an estate without proper structuring. I told her I had an estate attorney. I told her his name was Howard Rice, that I had worked with Howard for 16 years, and that if there were tax implications to discuss, Howard would be the one to discuss them with me. Marcus put his hand on my arm. He said, Dad, we're not trying to pressure you, we're trying to help. And the way he said it, soft, slightly wounded, was the voice he had used since childhood when he wanted me to relent. I recognized it the way you recognize a card trick the second time you see it. I said I appreciated the thought, but the answer was no, and I slid the folder back across the table. That is when Vanessa pushed her chair back from the table. She stood up. She said, loudly enough now that the room had no choice but to hear her, that she was tired of being patient, that they had done everything right, that Marcus had devoted years to a company he was never going to inherit fairly, that I was sitting on an asset I didn't need while they were struggling, and that my attachment to that house was nothing more than an old man hoarding a dead woman's belongings. The room went silent in the way that rooms go silent when something irreversible has just been said. I heard Patricia make a sound. I heard Frank set down his wine glass. I sat very still. I have been in business for 37 years. I've been in rooms where men tried to take things from me with lawyers, with leverage, with raised voices. I have learned that the most powerful thing you can do in that moment is to become absolutely still, because stillness unsettles people who are counting on you to react. I folded my napkin. I placed it on the table beside my plate. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. I said to Marcus that I would call him in the morning, and then I looked at Vanessa, and I said nothing at all, because there are things a person cannot unsay, and the only appropriate response is to acknowledge that they have been said and cannot be taken back. I walked out of that private dining room, past the bar, out through the front door of Carmine's, and into the parking lot where the October air was dry and cool and smelled like desert night. I sat in my car for a few minutes without starting the engine. Then I made a phone call. Her name is Diane Coster. She has been my personal attorney for 11 years, specializing in business and estate law, and she is one of the sharpest people I know. I had called Diane 3 weeks before this dinner, not because I had been certain something like this would happen, but because something had been building for months, and I believed in being prepared. We had spent 2 sessions reviewing my estate documents, my business ownership structure, my accounts, and the employment agreement Marcus had signed when I brought him on at the company. Diane had drafted a set of revised documents. They were sitting in a sealed envelope in her office, signed by me, witnessed, notarized, waiting. I told Diane where I was. I told her what had happened. She said, "I'll be there in 25 minutes." I said, "Take your time." And I meant it, because there was no urgency anymore. The urgency had been in the preparation. What came now was simply the execution. I went back inside, not to the private room. I did not go back to the party. I sat at the bar and ordered a club soda and spoke to the bartender about whether the Diamondbacks had a realistic shot in the spring, and he had opinions about that. And so did I, and it was a perfectly ordinary conversation, and I was grateful for it. Marcus found me after about 10 minutes. He sat on the stool beside me, loosened his tie, and said that Vanessa was upset and that she hadn't meant it the way it came out. I asked him which part she hadn't meant. He didn't answer that. He said that they were under a lot of financial pressure, which I knew was partly true. Vanessa's home decor business had not performed the way she had projected, and they had taken on more condo than they could comfortably manage. He said that all they were trying to do was plan for the future, for the family, and I asked him again which family he meant, because from where I had been sitting, the family in that room tonight was the one that had watched his wife tell me that my attachment to my late wife's home was a problem. Marcus rubbed his face. He was not a bad young man. That is the most painful part of all of this. He was not malicious, he was weak. And weakness in the presence of someone like Vanessa had the same practical effect as malice, because the result was the same. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry." He said it like he meant it. Maybe he did. I told him I knew he was sorry. I told him to go back to Vanessa, and I would speak to him in the morning. Diane arrived at 22 minutes. I watched her come through the front door in her charcoal coat, briefcase in hand, looking exactly like what she was, a woman who had not been rattled by a late-night phone call because she had been expecting one. I met her near the hostess stand. She did not make a fuss about the circumstances. She opened her briefcase on the small table near the coat check and placed 4 documents in front of me, and we reviewed each one quickly, which we could do because we had already reviewed each one at length. The first document terminated Marcus's employment with the company, effective immediately, on grounds of conduct inconsistent with his fiduciary responsibilities as a director. His employment agreement, which he had signed, contained a clause standard in family-run firms that allowed for immediate termination in the event of an attempt to acquire company assets or ownership stake through coercion or undue influence. The folder Vanessa had placed on the table at the birthday dinner of the company's founder and sole owner constituted, in Diane's considered legal opinion, exactly that. The second document revised my will. Marcus remained a beneficiary, but the Paradise Valley house was now placed into a living trust in my name alone, with Carol's sister Patricia named as successor trustee. It could not be transferred, sold, or encumbered without Patricia's consent during my lifetime, and it would pass, upon my death, to a preservation clause that required it to remain in the family for a minimum of 10 years. The third document canceled the limited power of attorney Marcus had held over one of my business accounts, which I had granted him 2 years ago for operational convenience, and which I now recognized as a door I had left open that I should have kept closed. The fourth document was a letter. I had written it myself, and Diane had reviewed it, and it said what I needed to say in plain language, with no cruelty and no embellishment. I signed where I needed to sign. Diane witnessed. She would file in the morning. I thanked her. She told me to go home and sleep. and that it would all look cleaner in daylight, which is something she often says, and which is usually true. I drove home. The house was the way I had left it. The kitchen light on, the way I always leave it. Carol's garden maintained now by a woman named Rosa, who comes on Tuesdays, still showing the last of the fall color outside the back window. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon and sat in the chair in the living room that is still, 4 years later, positioned at the angle Carol used to prefer, because she liked to be able to see both the television and the backyard at the same time. I sat in that chair and I drank that bourbon slowly, and I thought about 37 years of work, about the choices I had made, about where I had been too generous and where I had been too blind, and I did not feel angry. I felt something closer to the particular sadness of a man who has finally done the necessary thing that he should have done much earlier. Marcus called at 7 the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 7:15. I listened to the message. He sounded frightened, which told me Diane had already been in touch with the company's HR director, who had been instructed to deliver the termination notice at 8 a.m. Marcus said he needed to talk to me, that things had gone too far, that Vanessa was devastated, and that she wanted to apologize. He said, please. I called him back at 9. I told him that Vanessa's apology was noted, but that some things could not be addressed with an apology alone, because the apology addressed the manner, not the matter. The manner was her standing up at my birthday dinner and speaking about his mother the way she had spoken. The matter was the folder, the document, the plan that had been prepared in advance and brought to a table surrounded by 40 people who knew me and who would now carry the memory of that moment for a long time. The apology could not unprepare the document. It could not unfill out the transfer title. It could not uncalculate the moment my birthday party as the occasion most likely to produce public pressure sufficient to make me comply. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had not known about the document until the night before, that Vanessa had told him it was just paperwork for their estate planning, that she had presented it to him as something routine, something he had been meant to simply place in front of me. I believed him. That was the most painful part. I believed him, because it meant my son had been managed, positioned, and used, and had not had the clarity or the backbone to ask a question about a legal document concerning his father's home before allowing it to be placed on a birthday dinner table. I told him that I needed him to understand several things clearly. The first was that my employment decision was final and had been documented through proper legal channels per his contract. The second was that the living trust had been filed and the house matter was closed permanently. The third was that the $40,000 gift, the startup funding for Vanessa's business, and the various other financial supports I had extended over the past 3 years had been extended as gifts, and that I wanted him to understand I did not regret them and was not rescinding them, because that was not the kind of man I was, but that the account from which any future support might have come was now also closed. Not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of the understanding that what I built was not a resource to be claimed. He asked me what he was supposed to do about his job. I told him he was 36 years old with a business degree and 4 years of experience at a civil engineering firm, and that the question of what to do about his job was the most answerable question he had asked me in some time. He asked if we were done, if this was the end of us. I told him no. I told him that I was his father, and that I would be his father until I was not on this earth anymore, and that this was not negotiable from my end and could not be canceled by bad behavior from his. But I told him that the version of our relationship where I functioned as a financial floor beneath whatever decisions he and Vanessa made, that version was done, and that if he wanted the other version, the one where I was his father and he was my son, and we sat across from each other at a table because we wanted to be there, that door was open, but he would have to decide to walk through it on his own. He cried a little. I let him. We said goodbye. I told him I loved him. I meant it. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a moment, in the quiet of that house. $2 million of quiet, 40,000 square feet of land, 21 years of marriage and memory, compressed into walls and floors, and a garden, and a bedroom, where I still put my keys on the same hook she used to remind me to use, and I was aware, In a way I had not been for a long time, of how much of my life I had built with my own hands, and how little of it anyone could actually take from me. I called Patricia that afternoon. I told her about the trust, about her role as successor trustee. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that Carol always said I was the most stubborn man she had ever met, and that she meant it as the highest compliment a woman could give. I told her Carol was right. Patricia said she would come for dinner next Sunday, if that was all right, and that she was going to bring that green bean casserole recipe that Carol had never managed to recreate exactly right, and she thought she had finally figured out the trick. I told her I would have the wine ready. Vanessa did eventually send a letter. Not an email, a letter. Handwritten, which I respected at least in format. She said she was sorry for what she had said about Carol. She said she had been under more stress than she had handled well, and that it was not an excuse, only an explanation. She said she hoped that in time I might find it possible to have some form of a relationship with them. I read it twice. I put it in the drawer of my desk, in the back, in the section where I keep things. I am not yet sure what to do with. Diane filed the final documents on a Wednesday. She sent me a brief email confirming everything was in order and that the trust had been recorded with the county. She said to enjoy the weekend. I did. I drove out to Sedona on Saturday, the way Carol and I used to do in October, when the light hits the red rocks at the particular angle that makes you feel very small and very grateful at the same time. I sat at a picnic table near the trailhead with a thermos of coffee, and I watched the light change on those rocks for about an hour, and I thought about very little, and it was the most peaceful I had felt in months. On the drive back, I called Frank, my neighbor of 22 years, to apologize for what he had witnessed at the dinner. He told me not to apologize for a thing. He said he had raised 2 children and run a small business, and the only advice he had for me was to keep the good bourbon and keep the good attorney and don't lose either one. I told him I intended to take that advice. That was 4 months ago. Marcus and I have spoken 6 times since then. The conversations are careful, shorter than they used to be, feeling their way towards something that might eventually resemble what we had before, or might become its own different thing. I do not know yet which it will be. I am willing to find out, and I am willing to let it take the time it takes, because I have learned that the things worth keeping are the ones that require patience rather than pressure. Vanessa is looking for work. Her home decor business did not survive the fall. I do not say this with satisfaction. I say it because it was predictable, and because one of the hardest parts of being a parent, and I understand now that the role of parent does not stop at your child's spouse, is watching someone learn the lesson they were always going to have to learn, and understanding that your generosity was only ever delaying the education. The house is mine. The trust is clean. The company is being transitioned to a management team I trust, which I should have done 2 years ago. Tom, my assistant, has been given a raise and an expanded title. Gerald, my accountant, has been asked to lead the transition advisory. The people who did their jobs honestly and without agenda are the people I find myself most interested in rewarding. I still sit in Carol's chair. I still leave the kitchen light on. I still wear the charcoal blazer when the occasion calls for it. Some things you don't renegotiate. Some things you have already paid for in full, in years, and work, and love, and loss. And they are yours. And no folder placed on a white tablecloth at a birthday dinner is going to change that. If you are watching this, and you have children who have forgotten what you sacrificed to give them the life they have, I want you to hear something. You are not an ATM. You are not a resource. You are not a problem to be managed or an obstacle to be removed. You are the person who made the life possible. And it is never too late to say so. Tell me in the comments if the people you loved most chose what they could get from you over who you actually are. Where would you draw the line?